Have you ever wondered, like, why some big ideas just take off and completely change everything?
Well, others just sort of fizzle out, maybe, even with good intentions.
Exactly. Even the ones with, the best intentions. It's that core question we're really digging into today.
It is a fascinating puzzle. And, well, often the answer is digging into those deeper economic, those material forces, more than we might think at first glance.
That's it, precisely. And today, this deep dive is really your shortcut to getting your head around Karl Marx's, well, frankly, foundational work, Capital.
But we're not tackling the whole massive thing directly, are we?
No, we're exploring it through a specific lens. Gabriel Deville's 1887 summary. It's a study on scientific socialism.
And what's really crucial about that summary, isn't it, is the pedigree.
Absolutely. It was authorized, even reviewed by Marx himself.
Yeah.
And later by Engels, his collaborator.
So it's got their stamp of approval, essentially.
Yeah. Right. So our mission here is to pull out the most important bits, those key nuggets of knowledge, revealing the sort of underlying mechanics, how social change and economic systems actually work, according to this view.
And what's compelling, right from the get-go, is Deville's framing. He draws a really clear line. He basically asserts that any real social transformation, it has to be guided by science, by observation.
Okay, so not just idealism.
Exactly. He argues it can't be built on what he calls childish efforts or these a priori judgments.
So he's really setting it apart from those earlier utopian reform projects.
Very sharply, yeah. He acknowledges their, laudable generosity. He sees they had a very clear perception of the sufferings of the masses.
They could see the problem.
Oh, absolutely. They could critique the existing social order, often with real passion. But, and this is the key point for Deville, these utopians ultimately ignored the facts.
Ignored the facts how?
Well, they were driven by abstract ideas, notions of justice or reason, acting almost like metaphysicians, he says, or even anarchists.
Okay, so what exactly were they missing, these utopians, despite meaning well?
Well, if you connect it to the bigger picture, to Marx's whole materialist conception of history, it insists you have to scrupulously examine the facts and then draw conclusions from them.
So data first, theory second.
Kind of. It's about scientifically explaining humanity's path, especially, the capitalist period. It's a radical shift.
How so?
It suggests that if you really want to understand why societies change, you've got to look beyond the speeches, the manifestos, look straight at the underlying economics.
Okay.
It's not about designing some perfect system from your armchair based on your own subjective ideas. It's about understanding the system as it is.
So the argument is, look at history less like a story of great leaders or big ideas, and more like a scientific process driven by these underlying forces.
Exactly.
And that leads directly to his very stark claim about class warfare.
Precisely, yeah. At the heart of this whole scientific approach is the foundational idea that history, Marx asserted, is really nothing but a history of class warfare.
Nothing but. That's strong.
It is. The division of society into classes, he argues, emerges right alongside human social life itself. And it rests on economic relations, where some people are essentially forced to labor for others.
So think about that. Instead of moral arguments or, appeals to compassion driving change,
right,
Marx is saying it's the fundamental push and pull between groups, based purely on their economic needs and their power. That's what actually moves things.
That's the engine of history, according to this view. Material interests, not ideals of justice or fraternity.
And these social movements, the source says, they're basically never peaceful.
Right. It uses that striking analogy, doesn't it?
Yeah, the chick breaking out of the shell. Just as a chick must break out of the shell within which it is just formed. So a new system doesn't just gently sort of emerge. It has to burst forth, violently even.
That's the argument presented here. The new elements, they must act violently against the existing state of things.
And that's presented as just observation.
It's another example of that scientific observation approach, looking at how profound changes actually happened in history, rather than, wishing for some more harmonious utopian process.
Okay. So we've got this scientific approach demanding we analyze the cold, hard facts, not just wish for something better.
Exactly. And when Deville, following Marx's method, applies that scientific lens, well, one of the most maybe chilling facts they uncover is about something we encounter every day.
Which is?
The wage system itself.
Because, on the surface, it looks like a fair deal, right? You work, you get paid. Simple.
It seems simple, but the text argues it's really a critique of the wage system as just Well, a replacement for other forms of forced labor.
Like slavery or serfdom.
Exactly. Replace those older systems, but here's the crucial twist, according to this view. It relieved the capitalist, the employer, of direct responsibility for actually supporting the producers.
How so?
Well, the slave owner, for instance, had an interest in keeping the slave alive, fed, housed, however miserably, assured of daily food at least.
Right. An asset to maintain.
But the wage earner, the true producer in this language, they could only buy food if the capitalist actually needed their labor that day, that week.
Okay. So creates this massive uncertainty.
Profound uncertainty, yeah. Often leaving workers reliant on public charity or just precarious. It's a very different, maybe more subtle form of control.
This leads us into what I thought was one of the most, well, intriguing ideas, maybe unsettling too. This concept of labor power being a unique kind of commodity.
It really is central because the source explains its use creates more value, what Marx famously called surplus value, than its own cost, the wage paid.
And that difference, that's profit.
That forms the very basis of capitalist profit, according to this theory. It reveals a kind of hidden exploitation.
Hidden how?
Because the free worker appears to be paid for all their labor time. You work 8 hours, you get paid for 8 hours. Seems fair. But the argument goes, they are in reality working, say, many hours without compensation.
Like the example in the text.
Yeah, like working 3 days for himself and 3 days for free for the capitalist, as the source graphically puts it. The value created in those extra free hours is the surplus value.
So this isn't just a moral complaint about things being unfair. It's presented as a scientific accounting, almost, how value is systematically extracted.
Exactly. Making it a cornerstone of this whole scientific approach. It's about the mechanics of the system.
Okay. And if we follow this economic logic, this mechanism, where does it lead next? What happens in the system?
Well, what's fascinating here is how the text then details the process of economic concentration.
Concentration, you mean like big companies getting bigger?
Precisely. Think about massive corporations swallowing up smaller businesses, huge banks dominating finance.
So the sort of Walmarts and Amazons of their day and ours.
Exactly that kind of phenomenon. This concentration, whether it's happening in industry or commerce, finance, even agriculture, it's driven by efficiency, right? And the demands of large-scale production.
Makes sense. Economies of scale.
But it's presented here as the inevitable path towards collectivism.
Wait, collectivism. How does big business lead to collectivism?
Because, the argument goes, it's not an ideological choice someone makes. It's almost like a natural gravitational pull within capitalism. Small, individual, private property inevitably gives way to larger, more socialized, collective forms of production and eventually ownership.
So the system eats itself, in a way, leading towards something else.
It's presented almost like a law of nature, according to the source. Capitalism paving its own road towards a more collective structure.
And what about technology, machinery, big industry? We usually think of that as progress, right? Liberating us from toil.
We do, but here it's depicted very differently. Not as saviors, necessarily, but as incredibly powerful tools of capitalist exploitation. Well, they argue it leads to intensified labor-think faster assembly lines, longer working days initially to maximize the machine's use, and critically, the displacement of workers.
Job losses due to automation. That sounds very familiar.
Right, and this directly challenges what the text calls the compensation theory.
What's that?
That's the idea still common today that, okay, machines displace workers here, but they free up capital, which then gets reinvested and creates new jobs over there, so it all balances out.
But the text doesn't buy that.
Not at all. It labels this a hoax.
A hoax. Strong word.
Very. It argues workers are simply thrown onto the scrap heap into what Marx called an industrial reserve army, a pool of unemployed labor that keeps wages down for everyone else.
So the machine itself isn't inherently bad.
No, the machine itself is innocent, the source concedes. But in capitalist hands, under that specific system, it becomes an instrument for enslaving man, making every industrial advance potentially a public calamity for the working class.
Wow. So machines meant to free us up instead create this industrial reserve army.
Exactly. And crucially, this isn't just seen as an unfortunate side effect. The text argues it's central. It's fundamental to what's called the general, absolute law of capitalist accumulation.
A law, like gravity.
Presented that way, yes.
Yeah.
An inherent tendency within the system.
And the outcome of this law is grim. The text uses words like fatal consequence.
Extremely grim, leading inevitably, it argues, to widespread pauperism.
It paints a very, very bleak picture of the system's inherent design, doesn't it? Not just, temporary problems.
It really does. And it stresses this is a systemic issue, not about individual failings. This law inherently produces what it calls a relative surplus population, more workers than the system needs at any given time.
Which leads to pauperism.
Yes, as a fatal consequence. And that pauperism is chillingly described as the disabled quarters of the army of labor, like the wounded left behind after a battle. It's a really unflinching look at the potential human cost.
Okay, shifting gears slightly. Another really critical argument in the source is its stance against purely peaceful means of social change.
Right, it's quite skeptical.
It suggests, for instance, that education alone, while good, cannot fundamentally alleviate exploitation.
Yeah, the argument is no matter how much progress you make in education, if you have a non-property owning majority, they ultimately remain dependent on the property owning minority for their survival. Education doesn't change that fundamental economic relationship.
And what about democracy, voting, universal suffrage?
Well, the text acknowledges it exists and says it should be exploited, used as a tool, but ultimately it's dismissed as a paper weapon.
A paper weapon, why?
Unless it's backed by force or the credible threat of force.
And the reasoning for that is?
Because, as the source states very plainly, a class does not abdicate. A propertied caste does not spontaneously dispossess itself.
So power doesn't give up power willingly.
It's another point where this scientific socialism, as DeVille calls it, veers sharply away from any utopian ideals about just persuading the powerful through moral arguments. It claims to observe historical patterns. Ruling classes don't just hand over the keys.
Okay, and then there's this concept of the secret of primitive accumulation. This really throws a wrench in the standard story of how wealth gets created, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It challenges that sort of Horatio Alger narrative, the idea that wealth comes purely from diligent saving and hard work over generations.
So what's the secret then?
It uncovers what it describes as a brutal history. Not savings, but things like conquest, armed robbery, swindling.
So violence and theft.
Yes. And specifically, the violent separation of producers from their means of production. Think of peasants being driven off their land, losing their ability to support themselves independently. The enclosures in England are a classic example, often cited.
The state. Where does that fit in?
Far from being some neutral referee, the state in this analysis acts as a powerful economic agent, actively facilitating this process through things like colonialism exploiting resources and labor elsewhere, public debt creating financial instruments that benefit certain classes, and protectionism using trade policy to bolster domestic industries, often at the expense of workers or colonies.
So the state is part of the accumulation process.
An essential part. Capital, as the source memorably states, comes into the world sweating blood and mud from every pore. Uncovering this history of primitive accumulation is another key part of that scientific method. DeVille talks about looking at the uncomfortable historical facts, not just the sanitized stories.
Right. Okay. So finally, we get to this really profound, almost philosophical point about how property itself evolves.
Yes, it's about the nature of ownership changing over time. The text asserts that capitalist property, think large factories, corporations, is what Marx calls the first negation.
The first negation of what?
Of private property based on personal labor.
Okay, help me unpack that. So you mean like capitalism wipes out the old way of owning things, like a small farmer owning their own plot of land or an artisan owning their tools and workshop?
Exactly that. Capitalism, by its very nature, centralizes production and ownership. It expands it way beyond what one individual person can personally work on or with. It negates that older form of small-scale personal property.
Okay, I think I get that. It replaces individual ownership with corporate capitalist ownership.
Right. And then the text argues this process doesn't stop there. It has its own built-in trajectory, its own inevitable endpoint.
Which is?
With what it calls the fatality that governs the evolution of nature, capitalist property's own development inevitably leads to its own negation.
So capitalism negates itself.
That's the core idea. Capitalist property is, in turn, replaced by social property, property based on cooperation and the common ownership of the means of production, the factories, the land, the technology.
So capitalism, by creating these huge, socialized forms of production,
ends up creating, as Marx famously put it, its own gravediggers. It sets the stage for its own replacement by a system based on that common ownership. It's presented as a very deterministic, almost inevitable historical process.
Wow. Okay. So let's try and recap this journey we've taken through these pretty foundational and sometimes challenging ideas.
Sounds good.
We started with that key shift, right? From utopian dreams, however well-intentioned, to Marx's idea of scientific materialism, demanding this unflinching look at economic realities, at the facts on the ground.
And we saw how the wage system, which seems like a free exchange, is analyzed here as concealing the extraction of surplus value. That makes labor power this unique commodity, the one that actually generates the profit for the capitalist.
Right, the hidden engine. Then we explored how economic concentration, big fish eating smaller fish in industry, finance, everywhere, isn't just happening randomly. It's presented as this inevitable path towards a more collective, socialized form of production, driven by efficiency, not by anyone's political agenda.
Exactly. And we saw how technology, machinery, while obviously boosting productive power, is framed within capitalism as a tool of exploitation, intensifying work, lengthening hours, and creating that industrial reserve army of the unemployed.
Yeah, leading to pauperism, not as an accident, but as a fatal consequence, as the text puts it, of capitalist accumulation itself.
And we also touched on that skepticism about purely peaceful change. The argument that real shifts in power often require force or the threat of it, because ruling classes, well, they rarely just give up their position voluntarily.
Can't forget that secret of primitive accumulation either. That reminder that capital's origins, according to this view, are often rooted in violence, dispossession, state action, not just in thrift and hard work.
Definitely puts a different spin on things. And ultimately, we arrived at that really powerful dialectical idea, capitalist property as the first negation of personal labor-based property.
Which then, through its own development, paves the way for its own negation, being replaced by social property, common ownership, cooperation.
The whole framework really suggests that big concepts like freedom, equality, they aren't just abstract ideals floating around. They're outcomes directly tied to how we organize our economic systems, who owns what, and how production happens.
So as you, the listener, reflect on this deep dive into these mechanics of capital and society, as presented here, maybe consider this final provocative thought straight from the text. It asserts that real freedom, for individuals, for all of humanity, it can only become a reality through the socialization of the means of production, that this leads to equality in the means of development and action.
And it even suggests, quite radically, that once this is achieved, work itself might transform. It could become, get this, the condiment of the pleasures of laziness.
The condiment of the pleasures of laziness. That's quite a phrase. This text argues, remember, with the fatality that governs the evolution of nature, that capitalist production inherently produces its own grave diggers. It's a very bold claim about the system containing the seeds of its own demise.
Absolutely. A claim about inherent contradictions driving change.
So here's the question to leave you with. What would a society truly designed for the pleasures of laziness, enabled by everyone having access to the means of development and action? What would that actually look like? And maybe more fundamentally, what does it take, in your view, for any economic system to move beyond its own internal contradictions?